Up, fearless, amazing, excellent. Okay, this is the U.S. to 1877, and I want to set up the revolution today. I thought it was good to start with superheroes and to start with mythical characters because, as you've seen in the textbook, now that we've gotten to chapter 6, there's a lot of myth making that goes on in the discussion of the American Revolution. This is a course that all of you have to take, whether you're history majors or not. And this is in part because the Georgia legislature believes that most students don't know anything about American history. And the thing that they mostly want you to know about is the Revolution. And I want to have us think through the Revolution in a kind of critical and analytical way, thinking about what the Revolution is and what it means. After the January 6th stuff, it's thinking about crowds and thinking about violence and thinking about what where this comes from and what it means is important. I think Hao Tran said, how effective was violence in the Packback question. John said, were they really noble Enlightenment heroes? So there's a lot of myth making that goes on about the revolution. I want us to sort of step back and ask some hard questions about what the revolution's about, who's involved, and what it means. I think the coming of the revolution is important, and I think it's it's a valuable thing. But wrestling with the kind of contradictions of the revolution is one of the things I want to talk about today. So I want to set up the revolution. We'll talk a little bit about the triangular trade. We'll talk about commerce and crowds. We'll talk about the weapons of the gentry. And by the gentry, I mean like not the wealthiest American colonists. Talk about newspapers and ritual. We'll conclude by talking about the Sons of Liberty and then the limits of the Sons of Liberty, how they worked and what were some of the problems. So today, kind of setting up the revolution. How do we get to the revolution? Okay. All right. So we talked about triangles before, and it was apparent that New England had replaced England as a center for much of the Caribbean and South American trade. So the triangular trade was supposed to include Britain, but over time, increasingly from the say 1700s to the 1770s, New England merchants are kind of scooching themselves in place of English merchants and creating a new triangle. New English merchants were making fortunes by capturing legally and illegally much of the trade of the slave societies that were established in the New World. Now, the Chesapeake is generating, where's the wealth coming from? The Chesapeake is generating tremendous wealth from the labor of enslaved people who populate the waterways of the Chesapeake Bay. But they have to pay taxes for all the tobacco that's shipped to the rest of the world. So, for example, because of the Navigation Acts, the way they're structured, lots of people in the Netherlands are buying tobacco to smoke or to chew or to sniff, and that has to go to Britain first. The middle colonies are generating tremendous fortunes by becoming the breadbasket of the New World. The middle colonies are Maryland and Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Those states in this area are, as you can see from here, there are ironworks in those places. There's shipbuilding in those places, and where are we? Wheat, the W's. So there's a tremendous amount of wheat coming from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, also from Baltimore and Delaware. That wheat is going to flour. The flour is being exported to the Caribbean, and the flour is being used to make bread on plantations. And it's part of the way in which those Caribbean plantations work is that the enslavers have all the food, and that food is mostly food that's being provided from the Americas. It's much closer to get from, say, Baltimore and a flour mill in Baltimore than it is to get from a flour mill in London. And so this is so when we think about these places as being free, we should recognize that they're also kind of participating in this enslavement of other people. The wealth is being generated in many ways by enslaved people, and these other folks are benefiting in a way from being part of that network, even though they don't know it, right? Even though a farmer, say, in eastern Pennsylvania is producing wheat and it's being exported, he or she may not know that that wheat is going to Caribbean plantations where it's being used on plantations. Their sense of themselves as being as free people and not being connected to slavery is actually a little bit problematic because they are, in fact, part of this triangular trade. Okay, so, morning. Let's look at who's a loyalist and who is a patriot, people who are opposed to Britain's power and people who support Britain's power. And what's interesting, if we look here, so what's going on in this image? Who's loyalist and who's opposed to these, most strongly opposed to these taxes, most in support of the revolution? What would we guess from, what can we say about these people generally? The loyalists and the revolutionaries. Okay, the areas with the oh, good. All right, great. As Sophie's saying, the areas where the royal charters support the crown, and so the royal charter in New York, so that's the Dominion of New England, is based in New York, and that is the place where the charter is. South Carolina, that's where the charter is granted. Wilmington as well. Loyalists in the ports, right? Excellent. So the people who are in the ports are the ones who are maybe most directly tied to Great Britain. It's actually the largest ship owners that are tied to Great Britain, and urban areas, good, also tend to have more loyalists. If we think about divisions inside the United States, the Quakers, remember, were the big traders in Philadelphia, and the opposition to Philadelphia was a big center for revolutionary conflict, but the Quakers, who supported Great Britain, tended to be back out of the controversy, tended to oppose it. That's why Benjamin Franklin, who doesn't much like the Quakers, comes to period. Oh yeah, sorry. It's around this is around 1771, 72. Are there small numbers on it? Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's wrestle with this. I want to noodle with this a little bit because we can't really say that much essentially about what, but we should remember that New York City, for example, is a loyalist stronghold. And the area around New York is tends to very strongly support the British. Likewise, in Norfolk, the Port of Norfolk, the Port of Wilmington, the Port of Charleston, all of those tend to have very strong. We think about ports as being places where there was revolutionary conflict, but that's really way further north. In Boston, in Rhode Island, in places like New Haven in Connecticut, those places have patriot supporters. But by and large, the further we go down to the places that are closely connected to the Caribbean, the more loyalist sentiment there is. So let's break this down a little bit. I don't want to suggest that we have an answer for this, but I want to talk about why that is, why this breakdown exists the way it does. Because they see themselves as British, right? Many of the people who are in, say, Norfolk or in Williamsburg in Virginia or in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania see themselves as British subjects who just happen to be hanging out in a place that's part of a much larger British dominion. So very much like the way people who settle in Australia think of themselves as British subjects. Many Canadians thought of themselves as British subjects. So they don't necessarily think of themselves as Americans. It's confusing. This term is really post after the Revolution, patriot and loyalist. The term that they use more often is Whig, which is a little bit confusing. Whig being the people who opposed the power of the crown or supported the crown against the Parliament. Okay. So let's look at, we looked at this before, which is the source of tax revenues in Britain. And I lost, bear with me here for a second. Okay, the sources of tax revenues in Britain. And if you look at this, it's a little bit hard to read here, but the dotted line is land taxes, and the dashed line is customs, and the straight line is excise. So what's we know that what's an excise tax? What's a short definition of excise tax? What's an example of an excise tax? Yeah, they saw themselves as colonizers. Yeah. No, so that would be that would be a customs tax, would be an import tax. Common goods. Okay. So an excise tax would be if you buy beer at the or alcohol at the store, you're paying a tax to the federal government for all the alcohol that you're buying. That's why beer is more expensive than soda, even though it's cheaper to make, is in part because there's a tax on, an excise tax on that. If you buy cigarettes or vape or anything like that, you're paying an excise tax for the tobacco. Actually, vaping is not covered by excise tax, but cigarettes, there's a tax on those things, an excise tax. So a tax is basically sort of a sin tax, a tax on things that are seen as luxuries. So an excise tax might be on luxury goods of various sorts. Tea would also be taxed. Tea is no longer taxed, but the things that are still taxed by excise taxes are things like beer and alcohol today. Okay, yeah. So they're taxes on goods. They're supposed to be taxes on the rich, but are often not necessarily taxes on the rich. Okay, so what you see here is in Britain, basically. What I want to suggest is that in Britain, after around 1710 and 1720, there's tremendous opposition to taxation on land. And so the British landowners in the House of Lords and some of those in the House of Commons, who have a lot of land, object to these high land taxes, and they push those taxes down around 1720, and they stay down more or less for the remainder of the 18th century. They're replaced by excise taxes. And so taxes on tea, taxes on sugar, taxes on beer, taxes on rum are things that are going to be the source of British revenue increasingly, the majority of British revenue from the 1720s forward. Yeah, exactly. So that's why they threw the tea in the ocean, is because people objected to these taxes on tea. And on other goods that were seen as taxes on luxuries. The people who opposed the land taxes were the large landowners in Great Britain. People like Mr. Andrews, right? The person whose face looked like a thumb or a toe or something like that. The large landowners are the ones who object to those taxes on themselves, and it's the smaller folks who the people who are paying taxes on luxury goods that are upset about it. Okay. So, yes, the large landowners sat in Parliament. They controlled Parliament, really, because there was a House of Lords who were people who were lords of, and viscounts and earls and things like that in Great Britain. There were a lot of those people. And they had tremendous power. It's a little bit like the American Senate. They had tremendous power. They were, in fact, lords legally had, this medieval power, but they were the very large landowners, and they very much objected to having to pay large taxes. And as a result, the taxes are pushed onto these sort of sin taxes, like on tea, like on sugar. And so the very poorest people probably didn't pay these taxes, but lots of middle-class people, particularly in the colonies, paid these taxes. Okay, so if we think about the Loyalist strongholds, we shouldn't be surprised to find that the Chesapeake, the New England port cities, and Philadelphia are fraught. There's lots of conflict in there because we've got lots of loyalists there, but other people who object to these taxes. And so the tension is going to be in places where there's sometimes a strong loyalist sentiment, like Philadelphia, like New Haven in Connecticut. One of the ways that colonists benefit, so after 1763, right, we've got the French and Indian War, a war that was started by George Washington, arguably, by the Ohio Company that in Virginia is expanding into lands that it shouldn't be in, right? This is, where are we? Right up here, which is where Pittsburgh is. That's where the fighting starts when the American and British troops are attacked by the French. The French and Indian War goes for 1750s to 1763. It started in a way by George Washington and the Virginia governor. And so as the British see it, this is a war that the Americans started and the Americans ought to pay for it. So this is partly why excise taxes are also seen as the way to do this, because this is the best way to squeeze money out of the Americans for having, as George III sees it, started a war. Okay. So the colonies after 1763, after the Britain wins this war against France, one of the ways that the colonists benefit after 1763 is that British subjects are now defended by the most powerful European nation. They don't need to worry about ports being attacked by the Dutch or the French, for example, because it might invite reprisals from the powerful British Navy. Indeed, it's clear that one of the reasons that the colonies are so wealthy compared to Europe in the 18th century, and it is per capita very wealthy compared to much of Europe, is that they're not involved in all the wars that are ravaging Europe, right? The 18th century is a century of wars in Europe. And the U.S., despite being involved in the French and Indian War, is mostly isolated from many of these European conflicts. As a crown sees it, Britain bought peace for the North American colonies, and now the North American colonies have to pay. Okay, that's why somebody asked, it was Alicia Chawla said, and Lauren Jones asked, why all these taxes all of a sudden in 64 and 65 and 66, and all of them are basically ways of paying for the tremendous deficit that the British government has for having fought this war on behalf of, as they see it, initially on behalf of the North American colonies. Secondly, with the French out of the way, the North American colonists, yes, I am. This class is, I was wondering, Toxic NRG is a name I didn't recognize. This is the U.S. survey. It's at University of Georgia. University of Georgia students are the smartest in the world, and so this is our class. Yeah. My name is Scott Nelson, by the way. So with the French out of the way, the North American colonists can spread west. No, you're fine. It's clear that everyone, that while the colonies can benefit from international trade, there's also long-term benefits that accrue to seaboard cities from there being a west that can be taken from the Native Americans. Okay. So what are the benefits of westward movement for New England? Why does anybody in, say, Philadelphia benefit from people moving to the west? Or New York or Baltimore in Maryland up here. What's the benefit for those people about being in the West? Land, okay, new land. But the people who are staying in the ports, what's the value of people spreading west? Food. Okay, good. So there's food that's going to come from those places. Yeah, excellent. And they're going to sell them provisions, right? So a place like Philadelphia is going to get food from the West, where land is cheap, and they're going to give them provisions that they're going to make in those cities. Things like forks and knives, things like plates and dishes, things like iron and steel plow points, things like rope that are going to be manufactured in those cities. So there's a trade back and forth that's going to benefit these. So now that North American colonists could potentially spread west, it's clear that there are long-term benefits that accrue to those seaboard cities from there being a west that can be taken away from Native Americans. Yeah, they can. It's relatively inexpensive, particularly up here in the Appalachian Mountains. You can get land for pennies an acre. It's because in part it's so far away from international markets, and the land down here in what's called the Black Belt is very, very expensive. That's because of the black soil. It's called the Black Belt. But the land up here in the Appalachian Mountains is pennies an acre. And earlier on, like the Redemptioners and people like that who came over in the 1730s and 40s, those Germans who came over, when they came over, they were given land after their indenture period. Also in Virginia, people were given land. So land was cheap in the West, particularly the higher the elevation of it. Okay. So there's the colonies, the port colonies benefit from the port colonies benefit from this. Yeah, that's true. Fair enough. I mean, some of the clay in Georgia is not fantastic for growing crops. But think about New England. I don't know if you've been to New England, but New England is nothing but rocks, right? New England it's a crazy, terrible place to grow wheat. If we go back here for a second, the place where people are growing crops is not New England. There is nobody growing wheat up here in Massachusetts or Connecticut, or very few people growing wheat. The wheat is from these other areas, Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, and places like that. That's where good soil for wheat is. And the clay is not fantastic, but the Black Belt is really good. Maine lobster rolls. All right, yeah. Okay, there's also among Americans having fought in this French and Indian War in the 1750s and 60s an increasing confidence in their military capabilities. Officers and soldiers have battlefield experience, merchants who know about military supply problems, political leaders who understand about mobilization and finance. And so the conclusion of the French and Indian War helps make Americans, to a certain extent, more confident about their own abilities. Okay, the conflict then is going to be about those taxes, those excise taxes, those taxes on luxury goods that some people don't think are luxuries at all. Some people who are addicted to tea don't think it's a luxury to have tea every day. So the history from 1763 to 1776 is really the story of England's attempt to recapture some of the wealth that's generated in the New World to repay this massive debt that they owe for this war that they think George Washington started between France and England. All right, England benefits from this war with France because England defeats France absolutely, but they do see it as Washington's war. They do see it as a war that Washington effectively helped start and that needs to be paid for. As England sees it, the beneficiaries of the war were the colonists. Okay, so what do the colonists object to? First of all, they object to the proclamation line of 1763. Right? That's the line that says you can't move any further west than the Appalachian Mountains. That's King George III who says that. The proclamation line of 1763 says no one can move west of here. And that is, of course, already, we've got Pittsburgh here. Already we've got settlers who've been in here from the 1750s forward. And there are squatters, people who are on land that they don't necessarily have title to in this earlier period. And that's back to your question, MK Mom, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember exactly how to expand that name, but there were a lot of American settlers who were squatters, who basically just moved to the west, claimed land as their own, drew a fence around it, and called it theirs. And those people are also moving into the west as well. So King George III sets this proclamation line in 1763. He says there'll be no more land taken unless Britain makes direct deals with the Indians to buy that land. And there are a couple of treaties, in fact, that Britain signs after 1763 with the Cherokee and things like that to take land. Matthew, okay, sorry about that. No worries. I couldn't quite remember the name. Okay. So this sets a boundary for American colonists where they're not supposed to move past. Why would the British want a boundary line? Why would George III think that a boundary line is a good idea? All right, relationships with natives. And it's not that necessarily they love native people, but they don't want another war, right? Right, excellent. Gold Rush is 1848, 1849. So later than this. Yeah, right. So as the British saw it, they were killing the settlers. As the natives people saw it as Indians, people use the term Indians who are Indians themselves, saw it, people were stealing their land. But in any case, the violence requires the British Army to come in. And so setting a proclamation line makes a certain amount of sense. No more wars, no more money lost. Excellent. So there are kind of good reasons for the proclamation of line of 1763, but there are also reasons why people in the colonies object to it, object to being able to move to the West. As they see it, they fought this war. They ought to be able to take advantage of it. And it's clear that because of, remember, you've got this Ohio River that connects to the Mississippi River. That's great land along there, and the idea that this war is won and then people can't take that land is very upsetting to some people. Okay, so this is the controversy. There are people who object to not being able to have access to this land, and a lot of people who object to these new taxes on stamps and things like that. All right. Now let me talk a little bit about, I'm going to jump around here, the consumer revolution. This is a term I don't love because I'm not, everybody, you could argue that the 90s was a consumer revolution, 1990s. You could argue the 1730s was a consumer revolution. There's always a consumer revolution, just like there's always a rising middle class. But it is true that a lot of people are buying in the U.S., or sorry, the American colonies are buying goods that are coming from Great Britain. Yeah, they did. It was, in fact, it wasn't just necessarily becoming wealthy. It was the way in which you sort of provided for the future. You took a lot of land in the West, even land that you didn't need, and if you had sons and daughters, that land would be divided among the sons and daughters when you died. And so it was not just your personal benefit, your own wealth. It was the wealth of your children and your grandchildren that people saw land as a kind of investment in the future. We now have 401ks and 403bs and retirement funds and stuff like that. The retirement fund for most people was land in the West. Okay, so this consumer revolution, I don't love the term, but it is true that a lot of people are buying these British goods. That there's something like 15 or so imported goods available to consumers in 1720. By the 1770s, there are ads for 9,000 different manufactured items in Philadelphia newspapers. Okay, so there's a lot of manufactured goods that are available. These aren't iPhones, obviously, but they're the kind of 18th century versions of iPhones. They're silverware, they're cups, plates, teapots, fancy silver spoons and things like that. All the things that your grandparents are probably trying to foist off on your parents by now. I felt this. My own grandmother gave me all this silver that she thought was so valuable, and I was like, I don't even know where to put all this junk. But for for many years, collecting silver and porcelain and all these other things were a kind of mark of refinement, and there are a lot of people that are using these goods. There are a lot of people who are involved in trade. Women who are selling eggs and chickens at the borders of cities, farm women. Enslaved women who are sent out to cities to sell the products of plantations. Artisans like Samuel Adams who sell goods out of little shops in the center of town. A consumer revolution is the term. I don't love it because there's always a revolution, right? There's the financial revolution, there's the chemical revolution, whatever. Everybody's got a revolution. So, but it is true there's a huge number of consumer goods that are flowing. So the consumer revolution is the term that is used in the textbook. Right? Right? Yeah, everybody wants a revolution. Like everybody love that term. The font revolution. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say from the 1720s to the 1770s is the consumer revolution. That's according to the textbook. And again, it's a little bit fuzzy because people are buying stuff all the time and buying more and more stuff that they don't need over time. But whatever, there is something to this consumer revolution. Right, exactly. Okay, so transport, commerce, consumption, and trade are at the center of social changes in the 18th century. That is true, I think. It's here that world history is revolutionized, and it's here that the most potent symbols of change emerge. Yeah, well, so that's exactly what I want to talk about is non-importation, or what we now call the boycott, which does affect Great Britain. The people who it mostly affects, though, are the very large merchants who tend to be loyalists. Okay, so it's people like that, and that's a great transition to my discussion of these two loyalists, Thomas Hutchinson and Andrew Oliver. You don't need to know their names, but I found pictures of them, so I thought I'd show them to you. Thomas Hutchinson represents these changes. He's a rich merchant. He's in all three branches of the Massachusetts government, including the head of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. He's also, the governor and vice governor. He's also the idea that you could only be in one branch of government was not actually true in the colonial legislature. This guy was both in the legislature, the executive, and the judicial branches of the colonial legislature. He and this guy Andrew Oliver more or less kind of ran Boston. You could argue in the 1750s and 1760s. He's head of the Massachusetts. Yes, exactly. He was the head of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. He was assistant governor, lieutenant governor, and he was also in the legislature. Yeah, so at the same time, when the Stamp Act was being considered. And he urges caution. He urges that people should not complain too much about the Stamp Act. He gets them to withdraw claims to natural rights. And they say that the natural rights of Englishmen are being violated by the Stamp Act. Yeah, I would say it probably did affect the merchants more than Britain itself. That it's these merchants like Thomas Hutchinson that are most affected by these changes because he's the one who's importing tea. He's the one who's importing sugar and things like that, and he's the one who's hurt. Now, smaller merchants who are smuggling, they are hurt by these taxes, but non-importation would have hurt someone like Thomas Hutchinson especially. Yeah, dictator material, exactly. So in 1764, he urges caution. He gets them to withdraw the claims to natural rights. Then other colonies come back responding. And while Massachusetts says that the Stamp Act is not acceptable, but they don't use this, Virginia and South Carolina and Pennsylvania all say that this is brutality. It violates people's natural rights. And these guys were loyalists, yes. The big merchants were hurt by non-importation, by the movement to block tea, say, or to not buy tea from the British, to not pay your stamp tax and things like that. The people who would have directly benefited this would have been Britain, but also people like Thomas Hutchinson, who were in this tremendous amount of power. Then other states come back, all more radical, responding to the 1764 Stamp Act. And then the law is passed, and Hutchinson's brother-in-law and protege, Andrew Oliver, enforces it. And people called it the Hutchison-Oliver, junto, that they basically control, that's not a word you're familiar with, probably. Junto, Junto, which was a sort of they ran the colony of Massachusetts in the 1740s and 1750s. But then the idea of justice bends. As the opposition to this Stamp Act grows, by the summer of 65, oh, excellent, thanks, it's together in Spanish, and it's basically a cabal of people who run the community. conspiracy, really, of a tiny group of people that effectively run a state. By the summer of 65, suspicious episodes throughout Hutchinson's long career were being recalled in the newspapers. He commanded the most respect from many informed people. He was still a natural leader in some ways, but there was something crucial about his activities that had been missing. Some recognition that security and prudence were not necessarily the wisest guide to actions. Right? So the colonists are complaining that it violates people's rights. Fair enough. The violation of their rights, while at the same time they're slaughtering other people. This is a fair criticism. Gradually, the law that Hutchinson represents comes to seem arbitrary, and his honors seem undeserved, and the government seems distant and insensitive to the needs of the governed as people start to pay these taxes. So let me talk a little bit about the Boston crowds. So in 1765, the Boston crowds start first. And they give a potent dramatization of the Stamp Act. This is Boston next. When I'm embarrassed to say that when I was I was at Harvard for a year, and I was looking for Boston Neck because I knew Boston Neck was this important place for the American Revolution, and I could not find Boston Neck on a map anywhere. When I traveled around, I was walking around, it's like, where's Boston Neck? I know there was this place, this narrow little passageway. Well, it turns out that somebody recently showed this, that this is the map of Boston now, and they have filled in so much land in and around Boston that there is no more Boston Neck. All of this land is basically garbage that was piled in, garbage and seashells and things like that, were piled into Boston to build up the city. That's the image on the right. That's why I couldn't find Boston Neck, is because it's all filled. Anyways, there was a time in the 1760s when there was a Boston Neck. It was a narrow little spit of land. And Boston residents got a potent dramatization of the Stamp Act. What they did was they hung 2 effigies from a tree near Boston Neck. One was an effigy, a kind of basically a stuffed dummy of Andrew Oliver, the stamp distributor for Boston, the person whose image we saw above, the brother-in-law of Hutchinson. And the other is a huge boot with what's called a green vial sole. And it's basically a green boot with a green vial sole. And it's just a terrible pun on Grenville, right? Remember Grenville. So green vial sole. And it's painted green and made vile by rubbing dung on it. And at the top of the boot is the image of the devil peeking out of it. And this is a pun on Lord Boot and George Grenville. Men waited by the tree and pretended to collect stamps from everyone who passed by, and they did this all day. Boston Neck was an important spot between the town of Boston and the mainland of Massachusetts. It's estimated that 2,500 to 5,000 people passed these effigies as they watched the proceedings and went into the city. The idea was that everyone would learn how problematic it would be to have a tax and to have these stamps constantly inspected by people. Everyone was supposed to learn that the Stamp Act would radically alter everyone's lives. Toward the evening, a crowd of people gathered at the tree and paraded with those effigies to a small brick building that Andrew Oliver was having built on the Boston waterfront. They thought it was supposed to be the new stamp office, and so the crowd destroyed it. They tore it down, right? They demolished it. And they took away trophies, right, from the thing. They then went to Oliver's house, and they smashed all his windows, they tore down his fences, and then entered his house. And just then, Oliver's brother-in-law, Thomas Hutchinson, arrived with the sheriff. And the crowd then threw paving stones at the sheriff and Hutchinson, but eventually dispersed. The House visitation had done what it was supposed to do, which was to get Oliver to resign his office. And Oliver, as you can see here, died shortly afterwards. So he resigns in 1765 after the Stamp Act is passed, and he dies in 1774, about 9 years later. This is a kind of crowd activity that was common in the Revolution. This crowd activity It was not the stamp office. They thought it was the stamp office, and so they tore it down brick by brick. But it turned out not to have been the stamp office at all. It turned out to have been just another building that he was building. So they threw paving stones at the sheriff and at Hutchinson. Let's see. On Boston Green, I think, is where they're buried. Right? Okay. His faces look cursed. So when Oliver was buried in 1774, right, there was a crowd that arrayed themselves around it and cheered when he was put into the ground. Right? That's how much they hated them. So these are the people who are kind of potentially dictators in Massachusetts, as somebody said. They're kind of dictator material. They become very powerful in this colonial system, and there's sort of opposition to them, partly because they're enforcers of the Stamp Act, and partly also because they're rich people. So there's something to kind of understand about this revolution, which is that in a way, what happens is there are a lot of ructions and riots and things like that form the basis of this revolution. Directly, it was an attack on a hated enforcer of the Stamp Act, who was Andrew Oliver, but it was also an attack on Oliver himself and the objects of his wealth. His glass windows, which were rare. Most people didn't have glass windows in this period. His fancy fireplace in his house was torn down. His books were torn up. And in other attacks during the Revolution, other objects of wealth, coaches, elite houses, and theaters were torn down. To get a sense of the hate these people had for Oliver and his brother-in-law, when Oliver died, as I said, in 1774, people cheered as his body went into the ground. And there was a riot, actually, around Oliver's body as he was buried. So there were a lot of public rituals and crowd actions like this. The Boston Tea Party was another example of this. And so there's a few things that we should know about crowds, which are interesting and help explain the revolution, explain the energy of the revolution. First of all, crowds were almost respectable. Okay, we're used to thinking about some of the violence, say in Seattle, and the violence, the January 6th violence, as not being respectable, and certainly the January 6th violence was not respectable, and violence in any event is problematic. But violence was part of how the revolution played out. Violent conflicts like this are how the revolution played out. And they were common. Okay. In urban settings in Europe, these kinds of crowd activities were incredibly common. And so this is an example, actually, after the revolution and this is a hostile image, but it kind of gets the sense of, this is the crowd that surrounded George III in 1795 and attacked him and shot at him. He was not killed, but he was in some danger. And the image here is not a very, but crowds were common in the 18th century. Crowds and to some extent, crowds were respectable, right? Crowds enforced the law. There weren't modern police departments, so crowds called sheriff's posses who would enforce the law in the colonies. Crowds fought fires. So there weren't modern fire departments. And so crowds called volunteer fire companies to save property and lives. But the volunteer fire companies tended to be sort of drunken groups of people who would sometimes fight each other. If there was a fire in on 13th Street in New York, and it was between the volunteer fire department on 30th Street and the fire department on 10th Street, there'd sometimes be fights between the 10th Street and the 30th Street fire departments over who got to fight the fires. So crowds are basically how fires were fought. Crowds are how policing took place, because there weren't really police. Crowds fought outsiders. And in fact, you could argue that armies are really kind of crowds in uniforms. They're drawn into ranks and given officers in the 18th century and called militias. And a militia, to a certain extent, is a kind of crowd. It's not especially well disciplined, and it can be, it's obviously quite violent, but it could also be indisciplined and lead to mayhem. From the times of the first wars against the Indians, people would gather together to defend communities or attack other ones, and we saw tremendous violence that takes place. So it's a pretty disorganized group of men at first, for example, who gathered together to protect the armories at Lexington and Concord that became the first group of militiamen that would battle the English army in the war. The Battle of Lexington and Concord, quote unquote, it's called the Battle of Lexington and Concord, was in a really way a kind of mob action, a mob against British regulars. And that's in part why the first couple of skirmishes, the British won, and the last one, the Americans won. Okay, so if we look at crowd behavior on both sides of the Atlantic, people weren't always killed, but it could be somewhat dangerous. The exception that proved the rule is a crowd in Boston in February of 1770, when a crowd was milling around the house of a customs informer named Ebenezer Richardson. And he fired into the crowd and shot and killed a boy named Christopher Snyder, and thousands went to the funeral on February 26th. A few days later, on March 5th, the anniversary is coming up, a soldier was looking for work in the South End Rope Walk, which is a place where people make rope. It's a big factory where they take hemp and they turn it into rope. And one of the rope makers taunted him and offered this soldier a job cleaning his toilet. And the soldier went back and got some other soldiers, and a fight developed. And it's basically a kind of one mob against another, a mob of British soldiers against a mob of sort of American workers. And at the height, 40 soldiers were trading punches with workers in the city of Boston. Yes, right. Okay, sorry. This fighting between workers and this is a good point. So this fight between workers started was sometime around March 1st or something like that. A few nights later, on March 5th, a bunch of men who worked at the rope walk started throwing snowballs at the customs house sentries. And this included a black man named Crispus Attucks, who was an enslaved person who had escaped. This was connected to a long string of grievances between the people. Challenges by sentries in the streets who would stop people for seemingly no reason. Bands marching past during church services, which people objected to. Soldiers getting work in Boston when other people couldn't get work. And the death of this boy, Christopher Snyder. The snowballs that were thrown were a pretty mild kind of attack. And the soldiers, who were young and sent far away from home, serving in a place where they hated, were not especially disciplined. They were the dregs of British society. What they saw was a vicious, irrational mob, not an outraged group of citizens. And when someone in the crowd of soldiers gave an order to fire, they didn't pause and ask who gave it. 5 Bostonians were killed and dozens more were wounded in what's called the Boston Massacre. And this was on March 5th. Bostonians would commemorate this day every year until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. What it suggests is the nature of the grievances. British soldiers regulating the commerce of Boston citizens, and that deaths could grow out of a misunderstanding. What's unique about many of these crowd incidents is that there was so little bloodshed. Relatively few people died in these crowd incidents, but they increase from 1764 to 65 all the way up to 1770. Basically mob, violence of one sort or another that is ultimately turned into, weirdly or interestingly, revolution. So how does that happen? How do you go from mobs to revolution? I want to suggest that the way that this happens is a group of people who are connected to these mobs, who are connected to these mobs that are called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty take these mobs and turn them into sort of armies and help them turn kind of what seems to be somewhat violence against the Stamp Act and other things like that into a revolution. Okay, so I want to talk then about people in this crowd who are like this guy here with glasses, let's say, and the hat. It's people like this who helped to spur this crowd. In 1765, in Williamsburg, which is then the capital of Virginia, there is a meeting of the House of Burgesses, the Virginia Assembly, rather. And the Virginia Assembly, Patrick Henry gets up. He's a brilliant orator. His father was a wealthy Scottish immigrant, but Patrick Henry had almost no education, and he failed as a farmer and he failed as a stockkeeper, and he decided to become a lawyer with no training. But he was a good public speaker, and through the law he became a legislator. And he was effective at bridging the world between the buckskin farmers, as they were called, and the wealthy planters. It's people like Patrick Henry that helped take this kind of mob violence and turn it into revolution. In the House of Burgesses in Virginia's capital, the governor kicks the legislators out. You saw in the textbook. And they have to meet at a tavern in Williamsburg because the governor refuses to let them meet. And at the end of the session, it's May of 1765, Patrick Henry introduces 7 resolutions against the tax. And his fiery speech leads the Speaker of the House to accuse him of treason, which you can see here. This is the person accusing him of treason by saying that he wants independence. The House of Burgesses is thinly attended, and it narrowly adopts 5 of the 7 resolutions that Patrick Henry brings. It then repeals it's against the tax, these resolutions against the tax. 7 resolutions, yeah, sorry about that. It then repeals the most radical one, which suggests independence from the crown, the next day. And this is actually a good predictor of the mood of most people in Virginia, at least the legislators in Virginia. They are upset about the tax, but they don't necessarily support the revolution. But what happens is that newspapers take what Patrick Henry says and reproduce it, right? So Patrick Henry does not represent the Virginia legislature, but the newspapers suggest that he does. In newspapers across the colonies, all 7 of those resolutions were reprinted, even though only 5 of them were passed. And it gave the impression that all of them had been adopted by the Virginia House of Burgesses. All over the colonies, the most radical documents were circulated in an attempt to provoke the crown, to get George III angry and fight back, and irritate people and provoke a revolution. Given the widespread literacy among whites in North American colonies, literacy that was required for many of the artisanal occupations that people had, these documents reached down into the social structure. Resolutions against the tax. Even for those who couldn't read, the criticism of British authority moved down the hierarchy. So in the 1760s, a radical Englishman published a journal called the North Briton, number 45. North Briton, number 45. And he's jailed for libel. But then the number 45 becomes a symbol of independence. Paul Revere, who's a silversmith, makes a punch bowl that weighs 45 ounces, which holds 45 gills. A gill is a half an ounce. In public toasts, people drank 45 toasts out of the bowl. Women, previously written out of politics, were also responsible for passing along these criticisms. So the Sons of Liberty are a new group of people. The Sons of Liberty are the ones who take these mob actions and turn them into revolution. And who are the Sons of Liberty? The Sons of Liberty were not the political leaders in Virginia, by and large, or in any of the colonies. They were people who were a little bit lower down on the social scale. They were 3 different kinds of people. They were dissident intellectuals. People like Patrick Henry, who had no job, really, except to be a legislator and a little bit of a troublemaker. Thomas Jefferson, who was educated at William and Mary, hated William and Mary, and was a little bit of an outsider. He was from further in the West and not treated as a sort of political equal by most of the people who were elites in Virginia. Thomas Paine, who was a radical in Philadelphia. Samuel Adams. All these people are kind of famous names now. They're the sort of, if we go back here to, they're the sort of Iron Man and Spider-Man of the American Revolution. But they were not the most powerful and important people in their time. They were middling folks. Some of them were coastwise merchants. That is, they had merchants that smuggled goods to the Caribbean or shipped goods from, say, Charleston to Philadelphia or Philadelphia to Boston. They were not the big merchants. The big merchants had too much to lose by this revolution. The big merchants had way too much to lose, but the smaller merchants who could benefit by there being taxes laid on goods or people not buying British goods were the ones who supported it, and also artisans like Benjamin Franklin and Paul Revere. So we've tended to turn these people into superheroes, but to a certain extent, they were the kind of second tier of people. But they very much had their kind of fingers on the pulse of these crowds. They were the people who knew what were angry, what made the crowds angry, and that included the Stamp Act, that included the tax on tea. And they were able to turn them into something else. So let me just briefly talk about these people. And I don't want to suggest, that we should all love Samuel Adams, but just understand what Samuel Adams is about. All right. Samuel Adams was from Boston. He was a Harvard graduate. Okay, so he was educated, and he served as a small town official. He was not a big leader in Boston. He was trained, though, in the classics, and he was a devout Puritan. Okay, he wanted Massachusetts to be a Christian Sparta. Right? He wanted it to be a place of soldiers and warriors who would defend the Republic against all comers. A place where hardy, self-denying, God-fearing people would think of the public and not themselves. He called this virtue. And that virtue was the most important thing. So he's a little bit of a freak, right? A little bit of a strange dude who is a kind of... right? Right? But that's Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams is this person, right? We think of Sam Adams now. I think Samuel Adams would be irritated, possibly quite angry at the number of people who got drunk from Sam Adams beer, because this was not Samuel Adams, right? He was a tip. He did not believe in heavy drinking. He did not really have a military training. No. He failed with a family brewery. He did start a family brewery, but it failed. It's not crazy to think of him as a brewer. He believed that beer was better than rum, and that's part of the reason that he favored beer over rum is because it wasn't as high alcohol. But it failed. He failed with tax collecting. He had a lot of time on his hands, and he was instrumental in getting troops to leave after the Boston Massacre. Okay? And some of these radicals had a Christian element in their thought, like Sam Adams. So like Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia, who was a physician. Others, like Tom Paine, were not Christians at all, right? Were deists or more or less outright atheists. Thomas Jefferson was a deist who believed that most of the things in the Bible were basically not true. These intellectuals understood that they had to work together and that their divisions were less important than their common cause. So Sam Adams and Thomas Jefferson did not like each other. Sam Adams and Paul Revere did not much like each other, but they sort of got along because they saw they had a kind of sense of what the kind of public wanted, and they were able to kind of spin that into what became the revolution. What was their common interest? What did the Sons of Liberty want? Number one, they wanted the American economy to be strong. All right, so they relied on the British Navy, but they weren't tied to the credit, trade, or legal networks of the British Empire. They had no friends in Parliament and no one to marry into the British aristocracy. Now, in the Caribbean, that's very different. In the Caribbean, those enslavers in the Caribbean who live in London and have their own seats in Parliament, both in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, have tremendous power. But people like Sam Adams and others have no power in Britain. And so they want a sort of strong American economy, and they resent the power of the economic power of Britain. Okay? Some of them were artisans, like Paul Revere, right? Who depended on exports to the old world, but for the most part, they competed with goods that the great merchants bought from Britain. So Paul Revere produces silverware and produces cups and things like that, and he's competing with British merchants who are producing it more cheaply than him. He turned out homemade and humble necessities like shoes and chairs. Some of them did. Paul Revere made silverware and engravings. And this is an image that he had painted of himself. And this is an interesting image, right? Because the image of himself is not, unlike others, he's got a work jacket on, right? He's got he's got his hand on his chin, which suggests that he's thinking, but he's also got his masterwork in his hand. is showing that he is a master craftsman. He had people who worked for him, but there were only 3 or 4 of them, and he saw them as journeymen, they were called, and they were close to him. They were, as you know, he was a master artist, and they were journeyman artisans. Right, his hands are not inside his shirt. He started showing. That's a good point. He started showing his hands. He's got this sort of look of, you know, what Rodin's the thinker, although that's later. He's sort of showing himself off as both a thinker and a worker, right? It's also it also speaks to that's his Copley who drew this, and Copley, unlike the British, can draw, and so he can draw hands, whereas in the previous image of the Andrews. Sorry, I keep ragging on the British, but hands are hard to hands are hard to draw, and Copley could draw some hands, so he's also showing off that he can draw hands. Okay. So, Paul Revere, his parents were French Protestants, and his name was Revoir, but he anglicized it to Revere. He was an aspiring mechanic, a silversmith. He climbed the ladder from apprentice to journeyman to master craftsman, right? And his hands are hard. Yeah, that's a good point. So his hands are hard. He's showing off that he works with his hands, right? That his hands are the source of his labor. They're not covered in gloves like the Andrews picture, right? He's showing that he works with his hands. In fact, that's in a way the center of the image is his hand, right? He was a master of his own shop, but he worked alongside and he could be comfortable. He lived in the north end of Boston, which was spacious, but it was not a mansion, right? He commissioned this portrait of himself by John Singleton Copley in 1768. So he was sort of celebrating his way of life and his increasing wealth, but he was not rich by the standards of the 18th century. So this is who the Sons of Liberty are. They occupy the space between the elites, like Thomas Hutchinson, and working people, the plebeians. They had some sophistication and a little leisure, and they could understand political arguments. These men weren't manipulators of public opinion, but they were spokesmen for people who were poor. Right. And so they sort of took and mobilized some of the energy of these crowds and turned them into something else. They fused the imperial issue, separation from Britain, with popular concerns like anger at wealth. So if we go back to this image, they're the people who are kind of behind these protests in some ways. They take they help mobilize the mob against these British elites, particularly the very large merchants in this period, particularly the British connected merchants. In a certain sense, this suggests that the same kind of commercial revolution that's going on in England is also going on in the American colonies, that some of these people have extra income, which they spend on goods, and non-importation becomes a way of pushing back against the power of Britain. Now, there are exceptions to this. Okay, so let me just conclude them. Who are the Sons of Liberty? They're dissident intellectuals, coastwise merchants, and artisans. And they're people who are kind of midway between the poorest folks who are involved in these, poorest working folks who are involved in these mobs, and the wealthy elites who they don't much like, right? And so they're able to kind of mobilize people in support of the revolution, and they're in a way also potentially restraining people as well, so the mob doesn't sort of go out of control. And you could argue that the Boston Tea Party, for example, is one of those cases where it's a mob action, but it's very tightly controlled. The ship is not burned. The tea is just thrown into the harbor. It's a mob action, but there's no violence. Okay, now there are exceptions to this. And there are places where this doesn't work. I've been talking about Boston. I've been talking about Philadelphia. I've been talking about a little bit about Williamsburg. But I haven't been talking about South Carolina, and I haven't been talking about Georgia. Okay? Those places are different. South Carolina is a place where rice and indigo are grown on the coast. There are hundreds of thousands of Africans living here who bring with them the traditions of planting, growing, and harvesting rice that come directly from Africa. They speak a kind of patois that I talked about before called Gullah, which is a kind of mix of 3 African languages, Yoruba, Igbo, and Ga. Since before the 1760s, many whites have been complaining that slaves were controlling the trade and economy of Charleston. We saw this in some previous chapters. The apprentice chimney sweeps in Charleston, who were all black, apparently fixed the price of their labor, discouraging other hired out slaves from taking the work. This is apparently the first collective labor action in the American colonies, is by enslaved chimney sweeps who fixed their own price of labor and forced other people to not work for a cheaper price. Stevedores in the city of Charleston. Stevedores are basically people who load and unload ships. Did the same thing, traveling around looking for better prices for their labor and refusing to work for particular employers, and stevedores would share information about who to work for and who not to work for. In addition, there were enslaved women who sold the excess goods of plantations, cassava, lettuce, and fruits in Charleston. When an enslaver sent enslaved people out, contemporaries called them country Negroes, with money to buy goods. Some of them would only go to the booths of enslaved women, and some would hold on to goods, not selling them to local whites and holding them for patrons that they liked. There were hundreds of enslaved men who would be hired out to operate small boats in the waters of Charleston. And while there was a law in the colony that every ship had to have at least one white man on it, it was nearly impossible to enforce. White elites feared was that these black men would use the boats to steal from nearby plantations and then sell to enslaved women. So in 1765, Henry Laurens arrives in Charleston. He is in the Sons of Liberty. He's not in the Sons of Liberty at this point. Radicals in the Sons of Liberty think that he's got stamps that he's going to force on the colony of South Carolina. Okay, so the Sons of Liberty in South Carolina don't like him, or they worry about him. He ultimately becomes a revolutionary, but at the time he doesn't. And the radicals surrounded his house and shouted, "Liberty, liberty," and stamped paper. Laurens tries to convince this crowd of Sons of Liberty folks, they're white, that he doesn't have stamps with him. He's not sure what he thinks of the Crown at this point, and he watches uneasily as the white radicals march through the streets. It's the largest demonstration in local history, and they unfurl a huge banner that reads "Liberty." Okay? This is Charleston, South Carolina, though. The following January, something very disturbing, January of 1866, something very disturbing happened in Charleston. A small group of enslaved people were in the streets of Charleston, chanting "Liberty, liberty." For the next week, the colony was in an uproar. Messengers were sent throughout the colony warning of what had happened. One of the enslaved men was banished from Charleston. By 1775, once the revolution is underway, there were rumors that the English General Gage had promised enslaved people that they could have the plantations of their enslavers if they killed them and occupied them. This is a rumor that circulated in Charleston. And then, in November of 1775, Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation to free all Virginia slaves and servants able and willing to bear arms who would leave their enslavers and join British forces in Norfolk. 500 to 600 enslaved men responded within weeks. The former enslaved men who escaped to Norfolk and fought for the British officers were called Black Pioneers. I don't know. With chests covered with sashes that read "Liberty to Slaves," they marched into battle. Others did supporting roles, and some were able to evacuate to Nova Scotia. More ominous, though, was the death of, and so this is one of the outfits. So this image of an enslaved person fighting for the British is actually by John Singleton Copley. It's by the same person who did the death of General Wolfe. But it's actually not that historically accurate because Copley was in Britain. This is actually the uniform that these enslaved people wore. He promised that the enslaved men would be free. The British did. So we have people talking about liberty in Philadelphia and in Boston and even in Williamsburg in Virginia, but not in South Carolina and not in Georgia, because when people start talking about liberty, enslaved people believe that slavery will end. And Lord Dunmore takes advantage of this once the war starts by encouraging African Americans to escape from the enslavers and to fight. Okay. What's interesting then is the story of Jeremiah. Was a black man, a licensed harbor pilot who had frequently piloted men of war through Charleston Harbor. A black man named Sambo also worked in the harbor. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. Yep, I'm late. Okay, well, I'll finish by talking about Jeremiah on Thursday. I apologize for that. 11:10 to 12:20. I don't know. Are we at 12:20 or 12:25? I think we're at 12:25. Okay. Okay. All right. I'll be 2 minutes. I'll quickly finish this up then. Jeremiah was a logical target. As a small network of men, he worked with a man named Sambo who worked on the schooner, Jenny who worked on the docks, and these men harbored or helped runaways as they could. These men were in certain ways precisely the kinds of men as the revolutionaries of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, except that they were enslaved. As the anger over the shouting of liberty shows, they were specifically not included in the revolution. Jemmy testified 10 weeks earlier that he had been approached by Jeremiah, and Jemmy knew where a runaway slave was hiding, and that Jeremiah asked him to bring a group of guns to that runaway slave. With this testimony, Jeremiah was hanged by the Commonwealth of South Carolina, and his body was burned. Okay. Yes, late afternoon. They should be there late afternoon. We're going to talk about the grades just to make sure everything's right, but they'll be released late afternoon. He was enslaved and, he was hanged and then his body was burned. Okay, the revolutionary crowd activity was at first about liberty. And then it's the group that hangs Jeremiah, that same group that hangs Jeremiah and burns his body. Crowds, especially in the South, don't necessarily become supporters of the revolution, and they're not necessarily nonviolent. In the South, political revolution threatened social revolution. The governor felt somewhat guilty about the harsh sentence that he passed, that immediate death and burning of Jeremiah. And many Sons of Liberty distanced themselves from the hanging and burning of Thomas Jeremiah. Here was a mob rule that they couldn't control. As events transpired in this race-conscious republic, it would be generations before Jeremiah's liberty ship reached harbor safely. Okay, so the Sons of Liberty are a powerful and important group that from Virginia all the way up to Maine are effective at communicating the revolution, but to a certain extent it gets more dangerous when one moves to South Carolina and Georgia.